Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the final round of the research paper competition presented by Major League Baseball. I'm very excited to present some of the top papers we got to this competition. It was a very selective process coming from 200 papers, and these are the three best that we got. Before starting, I just want to quickly introduce our judges. From 538, we have Nate Silver. From MLB, we have Will Edmondson. And professor at MIT Sloan, we have Tawhid Zaman. And first, I'd like to introduce our first presenter. It's Ben Foster, presenting on the analytics for the front office, value protections on the NBA draft picks. And just very quickly, in terms of the format, we're not going to have audience Q&A. It's going to be 15 minutes presenting and 10 minutes for the judges Q&A. And with that, I'd like to join me in welcoming Ben.
Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. As he said, my name is Ben Foster. I'm a PhD student in environmental engineering at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm going to present some work we've done to try to adapt some methodologies and philosophies on financial asset pricing to value protections on NBA draft picks. I want to make clear up front, when we say value, we don't mean a monetary value. We call it a basketball value. We're talking about things in terms of player contribution. And we do so because we're interested in draft picks as assets in a trade market. So teams can trade their future draft picks, and often those are for other draft picks or players. And so we want a common metric to be able to compare to those other types of assets. So there are some restrictions to this, thanks to our friend Ted here, who's an infamous or famous, depending on who you are, trader of draft picks. But the most interesting aspect of a traded NBA draft pick is that you can add something called protections to it. So these are conditions on the transfer of the pick based on its pick position. Pick position, as used here, we're talking about the draft slot. So this is determined after the season. It's a function of league standings and the results of a lottery process. So the easiest way to understand these is to look at an example. We'll use this example throughout the talk. It's one of our case studies, and it's the Lakers 2015 first-round pick, which was top 5 protected in 2015. So what this means is if that pick were to come out, is that my feedback? Can anyone hear that? Is it good? Okay. If this pick were to come out 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, the Lakers would get to keep it. And in that case, it would roll over to the next year's, where it was top 3 protected and then unprotected in 2018. So we call this thing, this base draft pick, so that's Lakers 2015 first round, plus its protection scheme, which as you can see can get quite complicated. We call that object a draft pick asset. So this is the thing we're interested in analyzing in our modeling efforts. So to understand the value of adding protections to base draft picks, let's look at what just a base draft pick with no protections looks like. I mean, it looks like a single distribution of possible pick positions. So at some point in the middle of the season, it's uncertain where you're going to end up in the standings. It's uncertain what the results of the lottery process will be. And so as such, you have this distribution of possible outcomes. If you were to trade this draft pick to another team, you're trading them this distribution of outcomes. And that has a single value as a trade asset. So when you add protections, you can start with the same base draft pick, and you can add all sorts of protection schemes. Here are a couple examples. And it turns out there are actually millions of unique protection schemes you could add to these picks, and that all of them change the distribution of outcomes here. And that gives this base draft pick millions of possible values as a trade asset. So this, why is this valuable? It's valuable simply because trades in the NBA are very difficult. There's lots of restrictions and limitations imposed by the NBA itself, and there's good reasons for those. But from a market perspective, we would say it's relatively illiquid market. It's not efficient at allocating assets to their highest value users. And because of that, the pick protections are this tool that allows you to tailor one of your assets and change its value over time. So imagine you're a team who is trading, say, for some medium value asset, or you want to trade for a medium value asset, but all you hold are very high and very low value assets. It might be very difficult for you to come up with some asset package that would be deemed equivalent value and allow that trade to occur. With protections, you can take your draft picks and you can modify their value, tailor it to the specific trade circumstances, making it more likely that you would come up with some equivalent value asset package. And teams know this, and they use protections all the time. So this figure motivated this work. which we started a couple years ago. And it's picks traded from 2011 to 2017. And we have the level of protection across the x-axis there. And you can see there's these three big clusters. That's top 5, top 10, and top 14 protected. If you think that teams are using protections to tailor the value of a draft pick asset for trade circumstances, it struck us as pretty odd that a whole bunch of trades required a top 10 protection, but very few required top 9 or top 11. So we thought, what if we could come up with a way to quantify the difference in value between, say, a top 9 or top 10 pick protection or top 11, top 14, and this led us to our primary research question. So we wanted to figure out how valuable pick protections are on NBA draft picks, and to do that, we built out a valuation system to calculate the quote-unquote price of any draft pick with any protection scheme. I want to mention again here, we're talking about what we call a basketball price, so not a monetary price. And I want to remind you of a potential purpose of doing this before we get into some of the details. This would be to help inform teams trying to make decisions about where they ought to place protections if they're in a trade situation. Okay, so the basis of our modeling efforts are that we noticed that protected draft picks behave a lot like financial options. I'll give you a very coarse overview of what that looks like, but these structures, the first one for the draft pick asset value and the second for financial option value, have a lot of parallels. There's lots of complicated mathematics behind how we build out financial option value models. In fact, Nobel Prizes have been awarded for describing these models. I'm pretty sure we won't get one for describing draft pick asset values, and we're not even going to use the same math, but the underlying principles that led them to that math are useful in describing draft pick asset value. So these are the broad categories, the broad principles that we adapted. We started with characterizing the volatility in the underlying asset. So this underlying asset for us is that base draft pick. We then needed to assess how the contractual conditions, the protections, altered that value, and then account for market risk. This is where we boil everything down into a single asset value. So loosely, our system falls into those principles in this way, but I'm going to remove those colors and kind of just talk about this modular system that we built out. There's lots of details in each of these gray boxes. I'm not going to get into them too much. They're in the paper, they're on the poster, and I'd be happy to answer questions about them. I'll give you kind of broad overview of what each of these boxes looks like. So these first two are to capture two sources of uncertainty. So one is in team performance. We want to answer the question, where will a team finish in the standings? So to do this, we use an ELO ratings system-based simulation of the NBA season to try to estimate the distribution of a team finishing at any given standings position. So this is actually inverted position. So 1 is the worst team in the league, and so on. So we did that so that it lines up better with how we allocate picks. There are more complicated ways to do this. This is a side project for both of us. We have full-time day jobs and limited computing resources, and so this was a simple model to implement for now. But we made the system modular so we could update methods over time. So with that Lakers 2015 pick, which the second time it was traded on the trade deadline in 2015, it went from the Suns to the Sixers, and this was our estimate of the standings position distribution for the rest of that season. Okay, so module 2 is to answer the question, how valuable is a player picked at each pick position? So the issue here is that you get the first pick, you might end up with Anthony Bennett, you might end up with LeBron James, and you want to capture that uncertainty in how valuable a player could be at any given pick position. So to do this, we use some historic data from Basketball Reference. It's player performance data indexed by when the player was picked. We've chosen to value our players using win shares over the first 5 years of their career. You could choose anything you want here if you have proprietary metrics or other preferred metrics. We thought this was an easy to interpret one and did a decent job at capturing the value of players. And then we build out cumulative probability distributions for each pick. So this is what pick 1 looks like. LeBron James and Tim Duncan are up here. Anthony Bennett's down here. Andrew Bogut's somewhere in the middle. And then we can build this out for every pick position. So we go pick 1 through pick 30. We're interested in the first round here, so we stop at 30. Okay, so we've captured some of the uncertainty in these two different areas here. We've kind of described it. We have distributions to describe it, and we want to combine those together and then account for lottery probabilities and a protection scheme. We do so in a Monte Carlo simulation that has a whole bunch of steps, but the broad details are here. So we start with that module 1 output. We then account for the draft lottery and the protection scheme. We then bring in module 2. These black arrows are doing a lot of work, but they are all we can do for now, given time. And they produce this output. And this is the important piece here. So this is the value generated by the pick asset. And I'll zoom in a little bit so we can talk about it. So this is win shares over 5 years across the x-axis and probability on the y. And it's this distribution created from the specific pick asset. So that Lakers protected pick traded at the trade deadline in 2015. And so to interpret this, you might say, okay, well, the team that has this, it turns out it's the Sixers, has a 16.8% chance of drafting a player who is going to, or who we would expect to contribute 17.5 to 21.5 win shares over their first 5 years in the league. All right, so we've gotten to this distribution, and now the trick is to take that distribution of outcomes and boil it down into a single value, and we do that using a financial asset pricing model. The method, I'll show you these results using this Lakers 2015 protected pick, which you've seen before. And I'm also going to introduce a counterfactual. So this is that Lakers 2015 unprotected pick. And this will allow us to say something about what the protections did to the value of that base draft pick asset. So the first way you might think about pricing these things is just to take the expected value of the distribution. That doesn't explicitly capture this difference in variance here. And this is what we might be interested in, because in this unprotected case, there's some chance that it's going to end up in the top 3, and that's a really valuable player, right? 50s, 60s win shares over 5 years, that's LeBron James. So teams may highly value that slim probability their franchise is going to change, so we might want to capture that in our pricing. So to do so, we use something called the weighing transform. It's a financial asset pricing model. The important piece here is it has this one assumption, which is called the market price of risk. This is the math. Before you get too blinded by it, the important detail is this assumption, this gamma assumption, or gamma parameter. That's called the Sharpe ratio for well-traded assets. You can calculate it, things like stocks or bonds. Obviously, we can't do that in the basketball case, and so we understand this as representing the risk preferences of the market. So the new question then is, what are the risk preferences of the NBA market in regards to picks? And we would expect them perhaps to vary by pick position. That's at least our assumption here. That is, teams don't treat the first pick or a chance at the first pick the same way they treat the 30th pick. And so to figure this out, we needed to group our pick positions into what we call asset classes. And so we start with module 2, and then we use a couple different methods here that go through and help us identify which assets perform similarly. And we end up with 7 distinct asset classes, which I'll flip through relatively quickly here. And then we assign each of these asset classes one of those risk parameters. So these are listed here. The way we do this is we calibrate them roughly from pick for picks trades, and then we use some interpolation to get to the pick asset classes that we didn't have data for. There's a lot more that could be done here. There's more creative methods, I think, that could be applied to make these more precise. But for now, I'll give you a general interpretation. These really good asset classes, so this pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we treat teams as very risk-seeking for those, and they're very risk-averse for these lower pick numbers. Okay, so going back to our expected value pricing, if we incorporate all this stuff into the weighing transform, throw that distribution in, we end up with these new prices. These are these yellow bars here. You can see for that unprotected pick, it gets pulled way out to the right by the tail of that distribution. And we would say that unprotected pick is worth 43.1 win shares over 5 years. The protected pick is pretty close to the expected value. It's 21 win shares per 5 years. To give you some ability to conceive of this, you can break down an implied annual win share contribution and then compare it to some players that you might recognize. So that unprotected pick is 8.6 win shares. That's about what Kemba Walker in 2018 produced. And that protected pick is 2018 Tyler Johnson. Now, if you don't know who Tyler Johnson is, but you know Kemba Walker, this will make sense. If you know both of them, it also makes sense. And for some of you, this is nonsense. But these might help some of you understand what's going on. The other thing we can do, because we introduced this counterfactual, is say something about what the protections did to the pick value. So we say the protections decreased the value of that base draft pick asset by about 51%. We can also think about comparing this to players who might have been involved in a trade. So this pick was traded at the trade deadline for Brandon Knight and Kendall Marshall, who ended up getting waived right away. But if we look at what Brandon Knight had done over the previous 2 seasons, he was generating about 4.5 win shares. Now there's other complications here. This is just one piece of data that you might use to analyze a trade. He was about to become a free agent, and there were other things going on. But this is an interesting piece, I think, to think about when we talk about trades. So we do one other case study in the paper, and on our poster, we look at the Bucks-Suns Eric Bledsoe trade in November 2017. And the interesting thing here is there were these low-end protections. So if we run this through a model and we take away all the protections, we get to about 20 win shares per 5 years. If we just throw on what we call high-end protections, we end up at 13. And the low-end protections raise the price back up again by a couple win shares. So this was value grabbed by the Suns, essentially, in this trade asset. Okay, we do a couple other things. We look at value of incremental protections. I think I'm running out of time. And so we don't get into these in the talk, but you can find them in our paper. And I'll jump straight to discussions and applications. So I think we've applied quantitative methods to say something about how pick protections change the value of the draft pick asset. But there's a bunch of ways we could improve. I've mentioned a few of these, and I'll just highlight 2. One is that team simulation, the ELO-based model, doesn't account for player movement, which could be a very important piece of a puzzle, especially when we're talking about trades. And like I said, there are ways we could do this that we haven't implemented yet. And then the other is better calibrating those risk preference parameters. The other thing we'd like to do is add some ability for users to customize their interaction with the model. So if you're using this as a team, you might want to input your own expectations about draft quality or team performance. And there's ways, I think, that we've thought about adding this in. So our applications, to kind of sum up, is you could use this to analyze past trades. We call this tongue-in-cheek advanced analytics of the front office. They've had their chance to analyze players and coaches, and perhaps it's their turn under the microscope. The other way to do this would be, or another application would be as private information, allowing teams to better negotiate pick protections. And then a larger vision here is to use the conceptual framework to look at other asset types in the NBA. And with that, I'll take any questions.
I guess with that, we'll let each of the judge ask a question.
Hey, my question is, have you looked at how sensitive your findings are to using win shares instead of another metric?
We have not. It would change those distributions. The orders, I think, would be similar. We haven't looked. We've changed the years, so how many years we sum win shares over.
Yeah.
But efficiency metrics start to have issues with playing time and injuries and things, and so we ended up with win shares because we could interpret it, but we have yet to test it.
Because one thing, win shares sets replacement level awfully low, like way too low, I think. And so I wonder if the fact that you find teams are too willing to trade for high draft picks would be different if you had a system set replacement level higher, and therefore the marginal value is harder to generate. But just curious.
Yeah, it would change the marginal value of the higher draft pick positions, right? If you used a different metric, either increase it or decrease it, I suppose. But
thanks, that was really thorough. My question is, if you could use your analysis to check historical trades and try to find if there was a tipping point, at which point club front offices started being quote unquote smarter with their protections, and if you found that or thought about it.
Yeah, so we've done these 2 case studies. We haven't been able to apply it to other situations. We've thought about it, and roughly I could tell you how teams got more sophisticated over time, just looking at where they put protections. Some of the more general results, which I haven't shown here, give us some insight into where you're in the standings, how much value is there in different levels of protection. So I've roughly looked back and could point out some teams that appear very sophisticated and teams that don't, but we haven't done anything systematic. Part of that is that quantifying the player side of a trade is not part of what we've done, and is another kind of big piece of work. I mentioned that Brandon Knight thing. It's probably not, it's not the full picture just to consider his win share generation. Contracts are all different and all that, so.
Very cool talk. So I have one question here. So the price of your asset depends upon the underlying dynamics and the probabilities and the whole mess there. So you get that from a Monte Carlo simulator or some like season simulator, but you didn't show me how accurate or else it's kind of error-metric for that season simulator. Because if that thing doesn't work properly, your value is kind of like useless, right? So how accurate is your team season simulator?
Yeah, so we use that ELO-based model, which, can't tell if that's me. We use that ELO-based model, which has been used in the past. It has issues with player movements, which is an issue when you talk about trades. I think it does, my understanding is it does pretty well.
Did you check?
We did not check. It's been checked by others. I can't remember I think Nate has written some things about it.
It's pretty decent, right?
Yeah.
Player-based systems are better, but like it's decent.
Yeah, and there's other ways to think about it. I mean, you could think about odds in Vegas, and you could think about lots of ways to project team performance over time, especially when you get out to multiple years in the future. That uncertainty gets really big. So it would definitely be sensitive to that, and we, in the future, would look at how we might improve that piece of the system.
Okay, cool.
All right, thank you, Ben.
Thanks.
Ready? Is he good? So next up, we have Javier Fernandez presenting on a model showing the expected possession value for using deep learning. Please join me in welcoming Javier.
Yep. So soccer is a sport with the highest value of a point there is among all the top sports in the world. So what this means is that 1 point in soccer, which is 1 goal, can change the game drastically from one moment to another. So this is one of the keys to understand why this sport is so hard to analyze. So if we take a look at soccer footage like this one, in which we overlay the pitch control model we presented last year to get some more information there, can you tell which actions are of value? Or how much do on-ball actions or off-ball actions of players contribute with an increased likelihood of scoring a goal next? Or how dangerous is to lose the ball in a certain location of the field? So these and many other questions are typical for coaches, but the current approaches in soccer do not provide some light to be closer to answer these kind of questions. Right, so in the year 2014, here at MIT Sloan, Alex Temur, Dan Servon, Kirk Galsperry, and Luke Bourne presented the expected possession value model, EPV, which I think it was first comprehensive approach to decision-making in basketball. But the most interesting part of that is the ability of asking not just what's the added value in one action, but what would happen if the player will take a different pass or a shot or a different type of action in that moment. So we can see clearly, if you inspect into that paper, into that approach, how valuable could be that for soccer, how soccer will benefit on that. But if we will try to implement this in soccer, the thing is that we will really need to do a drastically different approach in the way we implement and model actually this EPV value because we need to account for the nuances of this sport. So 3 main things are, first, that in soccer we need looser notions of possession. Losing the ball and where you lose it is so important. Also, the thing that we cannot assume that passes go strictly to the player's feet, but they can go to any location on the field. And also that to account for context in soccer is so critical. It's a sport when little changes in context change pretty much of what's going on. So basically, what we're trying to model something like this, or this expression, in which we want to know the expectation of scoring a goal or having a goal against, given all the spatiotemporal information we have in any given moment during the possession. So in order to do this, we model it as a markup decision process, and we assume that all the information we have at that frame in the moment is sufficient to estimate what's going to happen in that possession. So that's a big assumption, but in order to get there as close as possible, we need to really have a comprehensive definition of what a state is in that moment. So we're taking into account different factors, both contextual and spatial information, things such as the block positioning of the two teams, or something that we call dynamic formation lines, that is a clustering of players to know what are the different pressure lines, providing information about block pressure, and if you are during a build-up or a progression phase or a finalization phase. We add lots of spatial information, specifically the physics-based pitch control model, that also derives information as spatial advantage and pressure, and taking into account velocity and positioning information about players. And of course, everything we have about absolute and relative position of players, passing lines, and so on. So when we define this state thoroughly, once we have this, what we want to do is to integrate over all the possible paths the possession can follow from that state, and we end up having something like this. So this is the EBV estimation at any given frame, and we can see very interesting things going on. Like just now, for example, this pass back to Iniesta, it's increasing value. So passbacks in soccer can actually increase value, and the reason for that is Iniesta is having more possibilities to move around, to get the ball. He's in better position to progress. We can also see things such as that advancing meters towards the goal does not necessarily increase the expectation of goals. We can see that the gradient of that curve or big changes in EBB can help to identify high-value actions, and so on. So this is really good. We can get things from this, but we're going to get the next question from coaches, that is, why? Why that value came high? And a second question, that is, what would happen if I will do, this player will take a different action? So in order to be able to answer that, we decided to model this as a decomposed model based on three main components: a passing component, a ball drive component, and a shooting component, assuming these are the three actions you can take from any state in soccer. So we also have here an action policy model that brings all the components together, which is basically the likelihood of taking that action at any given moment. We are taking into account that passes and ball drives can go to any location on the field, not just directly to the players. And even though we don't have enough time to get really into the technical details of how we implemented this, I'm just going to mention a few of the approaches we follow to do this. So for the action policy model, we are using a convolutional neural network. We have a couple of very custom deep neural networks for the expectation of passes and ball drives. We have some other more basic models for expected shots and so on. So I would like to show you how this looks when we model just one part of this. So I'm going to make the focus right now on this the expectation of passing, the expectation of goals given that we take a pass. So we basically model this. What we want to get is something like this. This is the expectation surface. So in red, you have the places where if you will pass there, you will have an increased likelihood of scoring a goal. And in blue, the places where if you pass there, you will have higher probability of losing the ball and getting a goal against. So this part of the component, we can also decompose it into these different parts, right? The expectation of scoring if the pass is successful times its probability, and the expectation of having a turnover times its probability of turnover. But the interesting thing is that we don't have just a picture of what is going on in one frame, but we have an ongoing estimation of those values frame by frame. So those colors you are seeing there is numerical information we have at any given frame. So that's interesting because you can, of course, analyze the added value or the decreased value when you take the action, but you can also see what will happen if we'll take a different action, or even inspect visually why things are showing the numbers are being shown in that moment. So we end up having, with all these different components, basically a set of layers or surfaces of information that provides rich data to start inspecting lots of different questions in soccer. So I would like to show you an example of how we can inspect just a couple of these things. You are seeing here the state EPV surface, similarly as what I showed previously. And the circle around players are going to be more filled up if that player is in a higher expected EPV added. This means that if you will pass to this player, you have an increased chance of scoring goals. So our players in positional advantage, or what is typically called in soccer superiority, right? To be in better position to really get the ball. So we can see here several things. First, how dynamic soccer is. You can see players are being highlighted, and then it changes very drastically when you move the ball away. And we can also see how some of these factors we're taking into account for the state are being meaningful for this model. For example, here, Rakitic is going to overcome the first line of pressure with this pass to Busquets. So when he manages to get this pass, you have an increased value of the expectation of scoring a goal. Busquets has different possibilities, but then he moves back, Madrid reorganizes, and then you have little possibilities to go on, so you have to start moving the ball around. So we can first start to get a better grasp of what is soccer about, and a second thing to grasp how well are players understanding that ongoing movement through the match. So we do think that there's tons of applications for this toolbox or this framework, so I'm just going to mention a few. The first one is pass maps, which is a typical visualization in soccer that typically shows frequency of passes and positioning of players. But here we want to add the qualitative information that EPV adds, right? So what you have here is the mean position of players when they got a pass from Rakitic. It's just passes from one player. The size of the circle is, for example, one of the features we're taking into account. It's a spatial pressure, right? It's how pressed are those players when getting the ball. So Suarez is highly pressed and Lenglet is less pressed. And the interesting thing is that instead of just taking the whole stat of frequency or added value for that arrow, we are coloring that arrow with three main colors that show the distribution of value, right? So what this basically says is that if you take a look to that arrow between Rakitic and Suarez, is that the top 25% of those passes are being of great value. So since it's so hard to understand what provides value and what doesn't in a sport when you have 1,000 passes in one match, but none of them really seem valuable, this is a way to get a fine-grained inspection of what is being relevant for that team or for those players or in that cohesive collaboration among players. You can also take this to a different realm, which is off-ball contribution. This is so important in soccer because players have the ball 3 minutes on average. So we really need to start taking into account what happens with this movement and how players are collaborating in different phases of the game. So in the first row, you basically have a typical location heat map. This doesn't say much more than just where the players are. Basically, it tells information about the position of players. But we can deconstruct this as the places where the players are generating value. So this is where they are located to increase value, or the places where they are located that where they would decrease the value of the possession. So this is very more frequent than when they are positioned to increase value. So it also shows a little bit what is soccer about. We can do, on top of this, lots of more things such as identify high-value actions, or really having a fine-grained inspection of on-ball and off-ball actions, as we mentioned. We can then split the game differently and really start to analyze what happened during build-ups, during progression, during finalization. These are at least 3 contextual phases that are so different, and you have to behave very differently from one to another. You can also inspect specific things such as goal kicks, right? What's the right way of getting out for a goal kick? How are players being pressed? Is it better a long pass or a short pass? And of course, it can provide, basically, the main idea is to get into the qualitative information beyond just the quantitative information we have in soccer until this moment. So it can be of high value for scouting or for even opponent scouting to understand weak points or strong points of those teams, of how our players behaving. So just as final remarks, within this is the first comprehensive framework for qualitative analysis in soccer. The main thing we want to provide is to take a look at this decoupled way of modeling that allows us to have better interpretability of this model. And for us, this is important because maybe it's interesting to answer one question, but it's so important to be able to answer the next question, right? To engage into that process of communication with coaches. So if they get the next question that is what if, or what would happen if we do this, or why this happened, we really need to have this toolbox or some toolbox to be able to answer to those requirements quickly. So these different components, a good thing is that they can be adapted or extended independently. So if you think that the likelihood of passing of Barcelona is very different from Liverpool or Eibar, you can adapt just that model independently to get different values, right? So you cannot just don't have to rebuild a whole model, and you don't have a whole black box model showing just one thing, but you can extend independent parts of that modeling. So as a final thing, we're trying to do, or to make a great emphasis on the importance of spatial and contextual features in soccer that we believe are so important to get an edge in understanding better what provides value in this sport. Thank you.
Javier. I think we'll open up for questions now.
So it's cool stuff. What kind of actionable intelligence is there from this? Like if you're a manager at a club, what have you found that would change the way that you would manage or who you would play, et cetera? How you'd play, who you'd play?
Right, so the first thing is that I think that for coaches and game analysts, just the idea of analyzing through data sounds like even shady or like this is not going to be possible. So there's something we did last week, it was interesting, that was just showing these surfaces to different coaches and asking them, what do you see there? What's that, right? So they said different things, I mean, different words of explaining that. But the good thing is that when we showed pitch control, they talk about space and controlling. When we show EBB surface, they said maybe this is where you can get an advantage from, right? So first, it's a good way of trying to make them closer to what data can provide. Then they don't understand directly, typically, that colors are numbers, right? So you basically say, okay, we have information of this player, and the information moves in time, right? It's not static. And they feel the game as a continuous thing. So I think that mainly what you can get there is a way of explaining stats better, to getting a grasp for what provides value. And in soccer, that's so important because they're always going to ask, yeah, but are you taking into account context? Are you taking into account pressure? And basically that is to accompany that process. I think that could answer many questions. We're not addressing here one specific question, but providing a way of answering many others, right?
Thank you.
Hi, that was great. Did you present last year as well?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to see your research progress. This is pretty exciting stuff. Thanks. So one thing that was going through my head as I was listening to you talk, and it's probably because I'm an Arsenal fan and they don't really play defense, is how this would go towards a defensive strategy. Is it as simple as just thinking about the inverse, or is there more complicated things to think about?
Yes, so the way we started this was saying, okay, let's just model if you can get a goal or not, right? And then it starts showing things, and we added our values and said, like, yes, this is just talking about pure offensive things. But in soccer, you need to account all the time to what will happen if I will lose the ball there. So we changed that whole thing up saying that you can score or gain a goal against, and now anything that you see in the whole modeling, it's taking into account both things, right? For example, if you say that you get a passing play profile and you're getting information about risk and reward, right? So the risk part has to do with what will happen if you will lose the ball there. So we're now getting questions such as, how dangerous is to lose the ball there? So in the past, we will answer that like, well, if you lose it here, they have to advance so many meters, and they have so many players there. Now we just can basically say, because of the whole configuration of the space and the historical information we have, if you lose it here, the expectation of goals of the opponent is this number, right? So you are getting a finer grasp for that. You can also turn it around and talk about, instead of finding spaces, it's closing spaces. Instead of creating value, it's closing value. You can see there that Madrid, when it moves, that is just defending, it's not just trying to get the ball, that's one part of it, but it's also trying to be organized. And when you move the ball around, you're trying to de-organize them, right? So it's like an ongoing process of battling for those spaces, and you can use it inversely for both things, I think. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot. That was a banging talk. So I had a question about your neural nets to build those surfaces for the passing. How is the training data structured to go into the neural network? Are you feeding it like just the coordinates of the players, their velocities, and then where the ball's passed to, and then the label is a goal or not? Like, how do you actually like build training data for that?
Okay, so you have a different training procedure for every component,
let's do the passing surface.
But even in general, they have very similar approaches, right? So the basic idea is we have all of this info of the state, of the current state, and for a target state, right? So we basically model from actual actions, passes that were successful and passes that were unsuccessful, what happened there, right? So you basically have a set of features describing that state and a set of other features describing the target state, right, from what happened. So you're basically generalizing a function of what's the probability of transitioning from one state to another, taking all the contextual information in both.
Your passing service has the colors there that indicate the probability that putting the ball there leads to a goal, right?
Yeah.
So it's a goal in the label of this data. So you have the features.
Okay, I see. Yeah, definitely you have a goal or no goal. So you're
but when is the goal like happening? Like,
oh, okay.
So I
see now. Sorry, I didn't get it well in that moment.
The dynamics. How is that mapped?
So we basically, assuming there's an episode, right? So the episode is the whole possession. So we have different events there, like passes and shots and ball drives, and everything is labeled as a final event of the possession.
So either
so everyone has a one.
Yeah.
If
it's either a goal or a turnover.
That's right.
How you label them.
So what happens? If one state is not really valuable, in one case you pass there and then it ended in a goal. But then hundreds of times it ended in a no goal. So the value of that state is going to drop, right? If one action is valuable, it's going to be labeled 1 many more times than labeled 0. So that's integrating all of those paths. Yeah.
So then for a possession, right, maybe that lasts like, let's say 2 minutes. How many like data points do you get from a possession of 2 minutes? Like how do you slice the time?
Definitely.
10 seconds, 20 seconds?
Yeah, you have info for every pass that just happened when they happen, for every shot. And then for ball drives, we're splitting that in terms of 1 second, right? So ball drives is every one second of a ball drive. Otherwise, there's a lot of correlation between this frame and the next frame, right? If you make it so granular, we also shuffle that so you don't have so many correlation during the training process from this action and the next action. But that's just a trick to.
In all, that's how many training points for the neural net? Like
okay, yeah. So we are training this on top of 1,200 matches for tracking data. So I cannot really say how many
millions of input samples for the neural network, or tens of millions, just a sense like the order of magnitude.
Yeah, so I don't have the right number here. It tends to millions. I can probably make the calculation now. It's around 100 possessions per match, and then you can have 200 points per possession and so on. I don't have the right number, but it
It's
really
a lot,
grows from
right?
there.
It's
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah,
It
it's a
just
lot.
makes you have enough to train that thing. Also, your architecture, how many layers is it, the neural network? We're talking 3 fully connected layers or?
Yeah, so for the action policy model, we have a convolutional neural network based structure, right? So you need lots of layers there to really train to learn from that spatial configuration. So that's around 6 layers for the convolutional part. The other ones are small, like expected goals one is just 2 layers, just very basic 2 layers model. We're also validating each model through calibration and also comparing with baseline models, right? We're not trying to just use the most complex things possible because it looks nice. It's just trying to see if it's grasping this information at the same time we are having a calibrated model, yeah.
So a 6-layer network, but I'm trying to understand the input state dimension is just every player's coordinates, x, y, and then their velocity and an angle of their velocity, let's say.
Yeah, so we're not modeling the whole surface at once because that has some issues with the output layer. We're just modeling information in the origin, location, and destination,
Like
right?
What is the dimension of your input to the network? Is it the pixel, like the
Yeah,
pixel
it's not
Or is
not
it
that big. It's around 100 features.
Got it.
Not for the action policy one, in which we are using the whole surface, but for most models, yes,
Right.
it's around that. It's not that big because otherwise you have some other issues.
Got
But
it.
of course you can extend that and trying to get a better grasp for the whole spatial thing. But in soccer, things, valuable things are so not often, I don't know how to say that, it gets really, really tricky to make it.
Cool.
make
One
it
more
work.
like fun question. So could you envision a world where like the players wear some kind of Google Glass and like they pipe these into the Google Glass and highlights on the field where to like pass the ball to?
So something that happens is that when we showed these surfaces, analysts and coaches were like, yeah, that's really cool. We need less colors and less stuff. Please just highlight when players are doing important things. So it's like, it's good to show that and that you can validate that, but we need less information to be able to see what we are used to see and then highlight specific things. So I'm not sure to imagine, you know, a player having that and then we still don't have a grasp of how a player, while looking, is, you know, generating snapshots of what's going on. I really don't talk much about that because it's so hard to predict, but
It's a fun question.
yeah, but I know that what it does happen is that you get players to ask specific questions about how to improve their game. So some will like visual stuff, some other not. For the one who like that, it's going to be very valuable to say, now you have to pass to him, and now he's marking him. And you can tell it by names, but if you can draw it there, it provides info, but definitely not the whole surface, like little stuff, yes.
Oh, one more fun question. So once the surface is built, right, it kind of tells you where they should pass the ball. Could you like evaluate how smart the players are, like game-wise? And if you did that, I don't know if you did that yet, but who's like a smart football player, soccer player?
Definitely. There's a thing about soccer that has to be analyzed that is something that you can tell about specific actions, but more about a set of actions in time, right? So if Arthur makes a back pass, then maybe he can have a decrease of value. Then someone passes to the side to Busquets, and the value keeps dropping. But then the movement opens up a bigger value in other locations. So the final pass there is going to have an increased value. So how can you attribute that to this player or to this player or to this player? So what you can have is get closer to understand the decision-making process of the player. Do they like to do the safe pass? When they do the safe pass, do they take the risk? Are those risks more valuable or less valuable? Why are they taking risk? Are we asking him to do that? So you can really get a more fine grain of how they're thinking, but probably it's going to be harder to correlate that directly to, you know, a final impact in scoring a goal that is so infrequent and rare event.
Very cool. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so last up we have Luke Bourne and Patrick Ward showing their research looking to acute chronic workload ratio.
All right, thank you. So today we're here to talk about a project that's been in the works for a little while. I've been to Sloan now for quite a few years, and one of my first experiences when I was here was with a vendor, one of the ones in the hall. And they came to me and they said, hey, we can cut injuries by 50%. That was the number. And of course, the scientist in me was like immediately hugely skeptical, right? But in the same time, there's like some little piece in the back of my mind that said, if there's any truth to this at all, it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Cutting injuries by 50% in any sport is worth a tremendous, tremendous amount of money. Now, it turns out that the claim was BS, and the company went belly up the next year. But what I realized at that time, and have learned a lot since, is that this is a huge industry. There's dozens and dozens of companies and independent consultants selling the fact that they can use load monitoring and other techniques to detect and prevent injuries. So I have become increasingly skeptical about it, but the truth is that until now, I've never really understood the mechanism by which these industries sort of make claims about injury prediction, but also that somehow simultaneously there's like a whole academic literature backing them up. So it really took a really unique collaboration. So I'm a statistician, Patrick here is a sports scientist, Darcy Norm's an athletic trainer and physical therapist across sports. So I work for the Kings, Patrick works for the Seahawks, and Darcy works for US Soccer. So we're really sort of across sports from very different backgrounds. It's only once we started to sort of put our skepticism together did we actually sort of figure out what's going on. And that's what this talk's about. Oh, wrong one. Perfect. Okay. So here's what our talk is about today. So we're going to focus on the acute chronic workload ratio. This is the #1 tool or #1 metric that companies and consultants and the academic literature is using to predict and prevent injuries. All right, this is, I should say, it's very, very prevalent. It's not just an industry, this is consumer facing as well. So I'm a cyclist and I have, the power meter on my crank and all that kind of stuff. And the software that I use, Strava, Trainer Road, Zwift, they all use acute chronic workload ratio to tell me, am I overtrained, am I undertrained, is my injury risk going up or down in a particular day? So it's very, very prevalent. Patrick's going to talk a bit about acute chronic workload ratio history. The important part being there, it's not just industry doing this. There's literally hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific publications in that world saying that this acute chronic workload ratio, which we'll describe in a minute, is predictive of injury. And then we're going to talk about the sort of fundamental underlying issue, and that's confounding. And so if you don't know what confounding is, the simplest example I can think of is that if you think about ice cream consumption and drowning deaths, it turns out that if you do a naive analysis looking at how much ice cream people consume and drowning deaths, you would think that ice cream consumption is causing drowning deaths, right? But there's a confounding factor that's causing both of them, and that's like, is it summer? Is it hot out, right? So that's sort of the basic idea of confounding. We're going to show how that relates to this problem and how that confounding sort of explains how all of this sort of scientific literature is suggesting this relationship between acute chronic workload ratio and injury, and then we'll sort of propose some solutions.
All right. Thank you, Luke. For those that don't know, the acute chronic workload ratio, at its most fundamental level, was a metric created to aid practitioners in understanding the training demands imposed on athletes. And it does so by evaluating the acute load, referenced as the most previous 7 days of training, relative to the chronic load, which is referenced as the previous 28 days of training. Load is very generic here. This metric has been applied to everything from internal load measures like heart rate and session rating of perceived exertion to external measures such as GPS and velocity-based variables, inertial sensor data, even something as simple as a 2016 or 17 paper looking at NBA minutes played in a game. Within the scientific literature, there's sort of this proposed U-shaped relationship between the acute chronic workload and injury, whereby if you have a really high acute chronic workload or a really low acute chronic workload, you're at a high risk of injury. So if you train too hard and you overtrain, high risk of injury. If you train too little and you undertrain, you're at a high risk of injury once you get into the game and a high load is imposed upon you. Within that, there's thought to be this sort of sweet spot where athletes at a reduced risk of injury residing somewhere between 0.8 and 1.3. And the positives of this value, it's easy to calculate, it's intuitive for coaches and practitioners to understand, and more importantly, it gets people considering previously performed training loads and some of the residual effects that may occur or residual fatigue that can occur from that. As Luke said, there's hundreds of papers on this. Not all of them are positive. There's been lots of people who have challenged the idea. It's no surprise that it's in most of the cycling apps that Luke talked about. That's where it kind of had its history, and then prior to that was much of the original physiology work trying to predict how Olympians would perform over a quad during training and taking training inputs. Along with the criticisms that have come, one of the things that we've talked about as we've worked on some training load and injury work over the past 2 years is with this metric is the potential idea that training schedule confounds the relationship, whereby you have this clustering of high intensity sessions that occur together. For example, we know from the literature, we know from practice that training in the training camp period tends to have higher training demands, higher volumes and intensities than training during the regular season. We also know from the literature and from practice that those periods of time also have the highest risk of injury and the highest rates of injury. So I'll kick it back to Luke. He'll kind of talk about how we tackled this phenomenon and I guess effectively challenged an industry.
So Patrick alluded to this history, this academic history, and I don't want to get into too much detail, but basically there's hundreds of papers across multiple sports studying this phenomenon, sort of looking historically at calculating this acute chronic workload ratio, which again is like your last 7 days to your last 28 days, and showing that it's predictive of injury. And so what's the sort of status quo? So this is what's done uniformly across all of those studies. And again, if you have a favorite sport, this has been studied in your sport. And almost certainly it has been shown that acute chronic workload ratio is predictive of injury. So this is the approach. They would take, you'd have a study, you'd look over 1 season, 2 seasons, 5 seasons, and what you would do is you would calculate for every session the acute chronic workload ratio before that session. So you'd take the average of the 7 days work divided by the work in the last 28 days, and then you would say, is this correlated to whether or not I get injured in that particular session? And it turns out that the answer is yes, uniformly across sports, that the acute chronic workload ratio is highly correlated with injury. And of course, the logical sort of next step is to say, hey, acute chronic workload ratio is calculated right before a session. Temporarily, the injury happens after, so it makes sense to make a causal link, saying acute chronic workload ratio causes injury. So what do we think the missing piece is? Well, the key missing piece here is schedule. So it turns out that there's a really unique aspect of training schedules across sports, such that it's not that acute chronic workload ratio goes up and it's causing injuries to go up. It's that there's another factor, schedule, which is causing them to go up and down together. And it's just like the example I gave before of ice cream consumption and drowning deaths. That sort of warm weather in the summer is causing both both ice cream consumption and drowning deaths to go up and down together. It's not that ice cream consumption is causing drowning, right? And it's the same thing here. The basic idea of this and the reason for it is that if I had a really intense last 7 days, so again, that's like the numerator in this ratio. So that means if I had an intense last 7 days, my acute chronic workload ratio is going to be really high. I'm going to be in that danger zone, right? But simultaneously, if I had an intense last 7 days, it's also more likely that the upcoming session is going to be really intense, and therefore that the injury risk goes up. So really, there's sort of this schedule this schedule over time is confounding these two things and causing them to go up and down together. Really, and it's through the session load in that particular session. And I'll get into that in a minute. All right. So how did we actually tackle this? So we looked at this in 2 different sports. So it's a bit hard to see, but what we see here on the top, that's American football, the NFL, and on the bottom is Italian soccer in Serie A so 2 different teams. And each dot here is a training load in a particular session. So all the dots, in both cases, all those dots along the bottom, those are off days. Those are days of 0 load, right? And on the top, and all the dots sort of at the top are is the sort of intensity of that session. You can think of it as, these are all come from inertial sensors, but you get the same results if you use rate of perceived exertion or minutes of training or that kind of thing. You can see, for example, that in the NFL example, there's sort of the bimodality. There's a bunch of dots in the middle. Those are like walkthrough days, right? So sort of not very intense days. The other thing that we show on this is 2 lines. The red line is the acute ratio. This is the numerator in the acute chronic workload ratio. This acute load, this red line, is the 7-day average. The chronic load, which is the blue line, is the 28-day average. So essentially what you can think of is that all of the studies to date, what they do is they look at leading into a session, they calculate the ratio of the red line to the blue line, right? And then they say, is that correlated with injury in the next session? So that's sort of the status quo. And in fact, to be clear, when we do this with our data, we get the same results. We see that, indeed, acute chronic workload ratio is very predictive of injury in both these sports. But there's something really interesting and really unique going on. So what we did is we said, hey, let's actually forget the injury data. Let's look at the loads in these two particular sports, and let's actually pretend we're in sort of a situation where acute chronic workload ratio is irrelevant. So in other words, we're going to call it like our null model, and that null model says that acute chronic workload ratio, in fact, any information leading into the session, like prior to the session, is irrelevant. And what we're going to do is we're going to simulate seasons 1,000 times. And in those simulations, we're going to say all that matters, whether or not an injury occurs in a session, is the intensity of that session itself. So when we simulate for a particular session, we say anything prior to that session is completely irrelevant. It has no factor. In fact, all that matters, the probability of an injury is just directly proportional to the load in that session. Okay? So to be clear here, we're simulating in a way such that acute chronic workload ratio and injury are completely uncorrelated. There should be no connection between these two things, right? So we're simulating sort of in the case where there's no relationship between these two things. So we simulate this 1,000 times. What do we get? We get the same results in both sports. So we simulate 1,000 times. We calculate acute chronic workload ratio. We see whether we simulated an injury in that session or not. And it turns out that these things are extremely highly correlated. Really, really tiny p-values. Right? If this doesn't shock you, it should. Right? We simulated very specifically such that these things should not be correlated, that acute chronic workload ratio is not predictive. In fact, it has no input at all in the probability of injury. All that matters is the session load in that particular session. Okay, so maybe this is just like we simulated too many seasons. Maybe it's just statistical significance, not practical significance. It's actually not the case. So in this simulation, it says we're going to have an increase of injury rate of 6.8% in soccer and 10.5% in the NFL. Okay, again, we simulated it, so this should be 0. Right? So this is pretty remarkable, right? We've done a simulation, sort of this null model, where we say acute chronic workload ratio does not matter for injuries. And in fact, when we do this post-hoc analysis, which is the same analysis that's done in all of these hundreds of previous studies, we see a very significant impact of acute chronic workload ratio on injury. So what is the cause of this? So here, what we plot here is the density of two different things. So on the left is American football, the NFL, and on the right is Serie A, Italian soccer. The blue line is the density of session load. Oh, sorry, all the curves are session load, in other words, how intense a particular session was. The blue one is when you're in that danger zone leading into the session, and the red one is when you're in the sweet spot, sort of the safe spot for acute chronic workload ratio. And you see indeed that basically the blue line is shifted slightly to the right of the red line, which is to say if you have a high acute chronic workload ratio, it's likely that the upcoming session is intense. It's going to be more intense. So that's really the fundamental sort of confounding mechanism here. That you need to fundamentally account for the session load in which the injury happened. So you think like, oh, that's really obvious, right? The most common thing to think about, are you more likely to be injured, should be how intense is that particular session. There's a really, really good reason why all these studies have not done this, though. And that's that the session in which an athlete is injured, that data is entirely censored, typically. Right? You're in the NFL, a training camp, a player goes down. The last thing you're thinking about is like, oh, make sure we get the inertial sensor and we capture that data, right? So across sports, when this data disappears, or sorry, when the injury happens, the data is typically lost. So in the paper, we propose a handful of different solutions to this. One is that if you have the data up until the moment of injury, you can use survival models and other techniques to sort of look at time to injury. You can also use the information before, or the training sessions before that are leading in to predict what the load is. Alternatively, you can use the load data from other players in the same session. You know, if a running back gets injured, you could use the load from other running backs to help you understand what the session load is. So to conclude here, we are not fundamentally saying that these 100 plus studies are wrong. We're not saying that the fundamental mechanism that's been studied is wrong. What we're saying is that all of these studies have found this relationship between acute chronic workload ratio and injury, but there's another potential, we would argue, much better explanation for this, and that's the sort of confounding of schedule. So it basically calls into question all of these studies and sort of makes us think that, hey, maybe we should sort of pump the brakes on this acute chronic workload ratio stuff a little bit. And we'll stop there. Thank you.
That will open up for questions.
Are you sure there's not a relationship between ice cream and drowning? like if I really like ice cream and I'm just kind of blissful and like walk into a pool or something. No, I'm curious. Have you presented this work to people who came up with this finding, other academics, I guess, or other people in the industry? And what's their reaction been?
So this is brand new. This is the first time we've presented it. I will say that I've had multiple people yesterday and today ask me if I have a bodyguard. Basically, the reaction's been one of two things. And Patrick's really the sports scientist. It's his community that reacts, but we've had one of two key responses. You have a big group of people that says, this is amazing. I now finally understand why this stuff doesn't work. I understand the mechanism by which we have all this literature and all this industry saying this stuff's amazing, it correlates with all this good like scientific work, but then simultaneously doesn't work in practice. So there's a chunk of those people, and then there's a bunch of people that are very upset about this because they've built their life's work on it.
Yeah, same. I think there's really two camps. There's a group of us that are highly skeptical that are using the appropriate scientific pathways to write the papers that essentially question this stuff. And then there's the group of practitioners that are inherently defensive about something they maybe have been doing for the past 5 or 6 years and feel very comfortable with. To which I say the positives are always that it gets people considering things and having a conversation with a coach. So from a practical standpoint, I think that is very useful. I just think if we want to move it forward, we probably need to consider other things within these types of models than a simple relationship like this.
On behalf of former high school athletes everywhere, thanks for killing two-a-days. Just thank you. And I guess my question is more along with that. Like, it's such a cultural thing, right? Yeah. Like, training camp is going to be training camp. You're going to have to do hill sprints until you fall over. That's just part of it. Yeah. How much of a net effect do you feel this will actually be able to have? I guess it's really early, but given your past experience, what do you think the likely next and tertiary steps are here? Yeah,
I think you probably have to look at something like a rule change that influences how coaches behave and apply load. Ultimately, they're the drivers, right, of the demands placed on the athletes in training camp or whenever. And because, particularly in the United States, there's no real, pedagogical pathway to become a coach. You don't, in European soccer, there is some coaching background that takes place where you study some fundamental physiology and organization of training and things like that. And we don't have that here. Coaches come up, you be a GA, you grind and and you work your way up and you essentially do whatever the people who taught you did. So you'd probably be looking at some way to constrain the demands. My initial sort of assumption is this idea of just limiting time, because it's hard for coaches to really get a grasp of regulating intensity, especially in a collision sport. For example, intensity is really hard to regulate. Once pads and helmets go on, people start hitting, but people also start moving faster because it's safe to move faster. When you take the pads off, people don't move as fast because wide receivers and defensive backs are scared of poking their eyes out and butting their heads and things like that. So I think that you're probably looking at something that constrains what the coaches are able to do, but how those decisions get made, I wouldn't, I don't know. I mean, the initial thing was people have talked about, well, what if you just extend the training camp period or extend the period before that to prepare the athletes, and that's always a big discussion. The funny thing about that is if you look at the literature in other sports, Australian football would be a great example where they have a 12-week training camp period. They still face the same problems and the same bottlenecks when you have a change of period, when you start to go into training camp or from training camp to the preseason period or something like that. And I think it's probably just fundamentally because there's this psychological aspect of things are getting more intense and we're about to play games. You also have players who inherently don't want to limit what they do because they're scared that, if I don't do this, work hard, I'm not going to make the team. They'll bring in someone who's going to practice, unless you're a superstar, relatively protected player. So you're probably looking at something that constrains the rules around how coaches apply training.
Yeah, the other thing I think I would add is that right now, I've worked on multiple teams, and this acute chronic workload ratio was used in all of them. And in fact, we talked with someone who runs one of the big, inertial sensor companies, and they said over a third of U.S. college and professional teams are using this stuff. And so what I've seen is they're not just using, but usually using with fairly high confidence.
Yeah,
And
most athlete management platforms that a team would purchase, for example, to house their data and produce some stock reports for the coach, it would have this as like something that you'd get every night, after training once you put your data in. So it's pretty prevalent.
So I think we probably hope that it just instills some uncertainty at the very least. To say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be blindly trusting this stuff as like the gold standard of injury prevention. Instead thinking more about how do we construct sessions that are actually going to be beneficial in the way we want without overloading players to increase injury risk.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Very cool stuff. Simple question, maybe I missed this. What is the correlation of the trading periods and this ACWAR number, whatever it is? Is it very high? Like, is it 90%?
It is high, right? And that's exactly the idea here, right? Is that the sort of training periods and international breaks and all-star breaks and training camps, like that's ultimately what's driving this relationship. So it is very highly correlated. I don't know the number off the top of my head.
Yeah, I wouldn't know off the top of my head. I don't know, but yeah.
Is there ever a case where the athletes like training really hard, like they have a high ACWAR, but it's not like training camp? Like, is there some other?
Yes, there is. Coming back from injuries, international breaks.
Bye week, off a bye week.
There's lots, and this is one of the things like that's causing this. I will say in our data when we looked at it, right, if we look at acute chronic work-load ratio and injury across these sports, we see this super strong relationship. But if you then just add in the session load as another variable in these models, the significance between acute chronic work-load ratio and injury goes from extremely significant to 0.
Yeah, but you're throwing in a highly correlated variable, so like the regression is kind of like. But then in those cases where it's not training camp, they're training hard. In those conditional cases, is there a correlation in that subset of situations?
Yeah,
that'd be the test, right? That's like your.
Yeah. I couldn't tell you for other sports. I could tell you that a lot of this depends on the status of the player. So, for example, when you're in training camp, inherently coaches are trying to prepare athletes for the rigors of the season, make sure that they're strong and robust and fit and able to handle it, and contact adaptation, and all of these things need to take place. When you start a regular season, you kind of fall into this cadence where we know that the game happens every Sunday, and we know you have 3 days to prepare and learn the playbook. And you also, I think, intuitively the coaches understand, like, geez, I can't, my first team players, I can't rail on them too hard because I know that if it's Thursday and I push them really hard and I hit the gas pedal, there's only a few days to the game, and that's going to create a problem. So the status of the player is something that would also need to be taken into account in a lot of these models. For example, and this isn't so much a problem at the collegiate level where you're able to retain a team of 120 or 130 players and have essentially a full practice squad. For us, we would retain 53 on an active roster and only a 10-man practice squad, which effectively means that guys who are, let's say, backup players at their position, they're going to have to be practice squad players. So even though they play on Sunday and they also participate in the events, primarily the backup players are your core special team guys who have to sprint the most, who are exposed to the muscle risks of high velocity movements downfield. Those guys are that would be the next step in looking at something that also potentially leads to this relationship, is the fact that some of these guys are taking on excess training loads that are probably similar to practice squad players, except the practice squad players get Saturday and Sunday off, and these guys essentially keep going. So status is a big driver of this when you get outside of those discrete periods.
Just so I'm clear, you have time periods when there's no training camp, but the ACWAR ratio is high, and you didn't check if in there, your analysis was a simulation on everything, which is your approach, but you didn't do this kind of technique to look when there's no training camp, maybe something else happened there.
Now, to be clear, this phenomenon of this confounding exists even if you remove training camp. There's multiple different points through the season where this phenomenon of confounding occurs. So there's multiple things, and they occur across sports. Yeah. So in the NFL, you have bye weeks that cause this thing to happen. It's not just training camp. In Serie A, the main driver of it that's coming is not just training camp, but also international breaks, which are causing players to go away for a week, then come back. And so when they come back, you get weird things where there's often intense game schedules, but then they also haven't had a high chronic load because they've been off for a week. And so again, it's schedule. So it's not just training camp. And the reason we know this is because if we put training camp as a variable in the model, it's not sufficient. to explain the relationship. You need to actually account for the session load throughout the season in all these different segments.
All right, cool, thanks.
Yep.
Thank you very much. So yeah, with that, that wraps up the research paper competition. I'd want to, again, thank all of our participants, especially those that presented today, and also a special thanks to our judges, Nate, Will, and Tahid, for coming along, and thank you all for coming out.